Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on best practices for life cycle assessment of direct air capture with storage. My name is Alex Krauka. I am a consultant and advisor with the U.S. Energy Association's Consensus Program. For those of you who may not be familiar with the program, it's a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management that seeks to educate the public, policymakers, industry, and other stakeholders and build a consensus on the benefits of and requirements for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as other carbon management technologies such as carbon dioxide removal, methane emissions mitigation, rare earth elements, critical materials development, really most things that fall under the broad umbrella within the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management we seek to support. We do this through a series of activities such as briefings and webinars like we're having today, workshops, which we do both virtually and in person, and as well as hybrid as well. We put out a series of reports and white papers throughout the year with some of our partners on the agreement, and then we have a monthly news clips that we put out to help keep our stakeholders informed. If you're not already on our mailing list and would like to subscribe, please feel free to email my colleague Michelle Littlefield at mlittlefield@usca.org. Just a quick logistical note, this webinar is being recorded. The presentation and recording of the webinar, the presentation and recording of the webinar will be posted to the event page. Please give us a few days to do that. And just an FYI for everyone attending, you are muted. However, please feel free to use the Q&A box for any questions or comments that you may have. And we will wait till the end to address those. Our speakers today are Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at DOE's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and then Greg Cooney, who's an engineer in the Environmental Systems and Economic Analysis Division, also from the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. But first off, we have a few introductory remarks from Sheila Hollis, Acting Executive Director of U.S. Energy Association, just to give those of you who aren't as familiar with USCA an idea of the organization and all the fantastic work that it does. So with that, Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alex, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be with the Department of Energy to discuss this incredibly important issue in a series of very thoughtful, really information-packed opportunities to work with DOE. A little bit about the United States Energy Association. It's been around for nearly 100 years and has two primary functions. First is convening, and educating and sharing of information as we're doing now. And the second is working throughout the world on behalf of the United States with USAID, the Department of Energy, and also with the Department of Interior on occasion. It is a tremendous pleasure and honor to be offered the opportunity to be in the acting executive director capacity. I can tell you that we are active throughout the world despite the vicissitudes of COVID and all the other complexities of the world today. And we have people deployed in the field right now and continuum of activity throughout the world. Work in Africa, Eastern European countries, all over, also South America, Central America, fair amount in India, and it's a tremendous commitment to make the world a better place. So that's primarily what we do, a nonprofit, non-lobbying, nonpartisan organization. So with that, just want to thank the Department of Energy for leading this charge and really sharing such critical, vital information in a time when the CO2 issue is so prominent on our minds and in our policy and planning going forward as a country and throughout the world. So with that, I turn it back to you, Alex, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few kind words about USEA. You want to check our website. We have multiple wonderful programs that are all free, available online all the time, going back a number of years now because as we went virtual. So you'll find a lot of information there, and I think you will find it useful to check it out.
Great. Thank you so much, Sheila. I think our decarbonization efforts are going to take effort throughout the world, and no single entity will be able to accomplish our goals without international cooperation. So it's great to be part of USEA's efforts in accomplishing those. And next, to discuss the leading role that DOE's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management plays in our decarbonization efforts is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox. Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alex. And thanks for all of you joining us today. I'm really excited about this work and really highlighting the efforts of Greg and his team in our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, specifically focusing on best practices for life cycle assessment of direct air capture with storage. And really want to emphasize that carbon dioxide removal, including methods like direct air capture with storage, are absolutely critical in terms of climate tools for us to achieve our net zero greenhouse gas goals. And as we think about carbon removal from the atmosphere, really the role that it's going to play in the near term is to counterbalance the emissions that are truly hard to decarbonize today. When we think about achieving net zero, we recognize that there are emissions that are just really hard to decarbonize, like from the agricultural sector. Some parts of the transportation sector could be aviation, shipping, or long haul trucking. And that to achieve net zero, we need to be able to have methods for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then the other aspect that's important is that we need to be able to quantify how much CO2 we're pulling out of the atmosphere. And we recognize that direct air capture in particular requires energy inputs, land inputs, water inputs. And so being able to do the life cycle assessment and the careful carbon accounting of these systems in a holistic way is going to be critical as we look at moving these technologies forward. Some of you may know too, in November at COP, we launched the Carbon Negative Earthshot. And this is really looking at investments across the Department of Energy, not just FECM, but also the Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Office and also ARPA-E and the Office of Science, really working together, investing in our annual appropriations in a collaborative way to hopefully achieve millions of tons of removal over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's across not just direct air capture, but a suite of carbon dioxide removal approaches. And so this tool, life cycle assessment, is going to be also critical for those other forms of carbon removal as well. I also want to mention that we have the infrastructure law funding. So the bipartisan infrastructure law over the next 5 years is looking at $3.5 billion of investment for direct air capture hubs. So the tools of being able to do the careful carbon accounting, and again, also things like land requirements and water requirements, all of the components that make up a life cycle assessment will be required as we think about demonstrating these projects on a significant scale. And so just really excited to have you all here today and for us to be able to have the opportunity to share our efforts in this space and hopefully really providing the framework for the tools for us all to think about in terms of really doing this in a robust and sustainable way. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. My introduction to direct air capture was actually a workshop that we hosted in 2019, and you were one of the main speakers at that workshop, as you had just authored a National Academy's report on negative emissions technologies. So I'm sure it's pretty cool to go from there to the position that you're in now at DOE. And fantastic to have you here in this leadership role. So thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Alex.
And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Greg Cooney, who, as I mentioned before, is an engineer at DOE's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and authored this report on best practices for LCA of direct air capture and storage. With that, Greg, you've shared your screen, so please feel free to unmute yourself, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Alex. And thanks, Jen and Sheila, for providing the introductory remarks. So yeah, today I am going to walk through this document that we published last month on best practices for life cycle assessment of direct air capture with storage. And so, yeah, first, I think I want to provide a little bit of background in terms of the purpose and motivation for the really creating this document. I think, you know, we realize that LCA is a framework that's well suited to do the accounting, certainly for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And you know, further, we know that we can also use it to assess potential trade-offs with other environmental impacts. This document in particular focuses on direct air capture with storage. Ideally, you know, as some of the other CDR approaches evolve and develop, we hope to produce similar volumes for other pathways. We know that as a framework, LCA is governed by ISO standards, so 14040 and 14044. However, at the same time, those standards are fairly generic out of necessity, and they generally provide the framework and principles for conducting LCA. And so our goal with this document is to provide specific best practices for some of the subjective elements that have to be made as part of conducting an LCA for CDR and for direct air capture. And so, you know, while we focus sort of specifically in some of our examples on the leading technologies and pathways for direct air capture, it's certainly not intended to be exclusive to those pathways. It could be applicable to future developed pathways as well. And when we wrote this document, I think we've established the four goals here. First, you know, we understand the importance of producing comparable analyses to facilitate robust decision making, and it's often the case in LCA that small differences and some of the more subjective elements within the ISO standards can lead to studies that just can't be compared or shouldn't be compared. And really our goal is to put out a set of practices that would help facilitate consistency and comparability. The second item, we know that CDR systems are evolving throughout the technology development cycle. And it's important that as part of an LCA, we understand and characterize the sensitivity and uncertainty in some of the key modeling parameters and decisions, and communicate that along with the results of the study. On the third goal, we know that LCA is more than just a carbon accounting framework, and we really want and encourage practitioners to leverage the full capability of the framework to illuminate any potential trade-offs that might exist, so that we can make informed decisions about these different CDR pathways and different approaches within direct air capture and storage. And then finally, this is the first iteration of this document. We look forward to improving it over time based on insights from the LCA and DAC research and development communities. So very much, you know, our first version, and yeah, we look forward to comments and insights from the community. So just to give you a sense for how we structured the document, we really sort of modeled it after the 4 stages of LCA. So sort of in the the traditional figure that's used to describe how LCA is conducted on the right side of the slide. We modeled our document after the phases of LCA, and we tried to really focus in on the key decisions within each of those life cycle phases that have significant implications for application to direct air capture with storage. It's important. These best practices are not in any way intended as a replacement for the ISO standards. We very much view this as a complement to the standards, and it's not exhaustive. It doesn't cover each of the elements that are mentioned within 14040 and 14044. What we do in the document is for each of these sort of key elements in the various LCA stages, there's a bit of background on the key decisions, and then sort of specific relevance to applying LCA to direct air capture with storage. And then really what we think are the set of recommended best practices for making that decision at that particular phase in the LCA stage. And so today, what I want to do is focus on a subset of the key decision practices. Really, these are the elements that I think we consistently noted as high-level challenges for LCA as applied to DACs, based on our review of the literature and just from discussions with a variety of experts and stakeholders. And so we don't cover everything in the document today. We don't have time for that, but I think these are the elements that I really wanted to dive in on. So the first element is the definition of the functional unit within the goal and scope phase of LCA. And so from the ISO standard, we know that the LCA has to clearly specify the functions of the system being studied as part of the definition of the functional unit. And the choice of the functional unit is linked to the goal and scope. And ultimately, there's a couple of uses that the functional unit has. First, it clearly defines the product or service and the characteristics that define it. And this is what allows the functional unit to serve as a basis for comparison with multiple alternative systems. We know that systems that don't yield the same function are not comparable. And so that's why the definition and the specificity of the functional unit is critical. The second element is it serves as a practical role in terms of scaling the various elements within the model. It acts as the primary reference flow that all the other inputs and outputs are scaled to. And one other thing, and we'll get to system boundary in a few slides, but I think especially in the case of a direct air capture with storage, the functional unit and system boundary are sort of inextricably linked, and you'll see why as I work through this. And so we know, as you expand upstream or downstream in the system boundary, it also affects the function of the system. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to walk through this example system. So we've got the direct air capture process in the middle. There's a series of upstream activities, related to the production of energy and raw materials, and then downstream activities related to the disposition and final storage of the captured CO2. And so what we're going to walk through is just a series of examples of different functional units that have or could be used in the context of DACs, and show numerically how the choice of the functional unit can affect the interpretation of the results of the study. So this example system, just a couple of other things. We include in the example capture of on-site fossil emissions. What's sort of important to take away from this is that may not always be the case, but just for the purposes of illustrating the importance of functional unit definition, it helps. And then, as you can see in the process flow diagram, there's two different types of flows that we're depicting. The solid lines are process flows. Those are flows of material, energy, or captured CO2. And then the dashed lines are emissions flows. So you can imagine we could define a variety of functional units, and we've got 4 here that we'll work through. 2 that are based on a cradle to gate basis, and then 2 that are based on cradle to grave, and we'll talk more about that when we get to system boundary. And so, as you look at these, just sort of comparing the words that are written here, I mean, they seem similar, but there are nuances that make them unique and potentially uncomparable. So the first one, the mass of CO2 captured, it's somewhat ambiguous in the sense that it could include both atmospheric CO2 as well as fossil CO2. And so you can see just by moving to the second functional unit, adding an additional level of specificity by noting it's CO2 captured from the atmosphere makes it more relevant, certainly in the context of evaluating CDR approaches. The third functional unit, so the mass of CO2 captured from the atmosphere and permanently stored, expands the boundary downstream. So now we're taking care of the final disposition and fate of the CO2, transporting and storing it. And then the final functional unit, this is sort of a playoff of the third one with sort of two changes. And so we have the term net, which implies that the final amount is iterative and should net out any positive emissions. So if we want to sort of normalize to 1 kilogram captured and removed, it's sort of an iterative calculation based on the third one. And the other point is that we go from just carbon dioxide to carbon dioxide equivalents, which would mean that you account for the other impacts of the other GHGs in the life cycle. And I'll illustrate how that one is calculated. So if we just look at the first 2 functional units, and yeah, just a disclaimer that the values we used are completely notional. Really, just the idea is to sort of construct an example so you can see how these sort of defining elements at the beginning of a study can impact the results. Yeah, both of the first 2 are on a cradle to gate system boundary, since we don't specify the disposition of the captured CO2, and in both cases the system operates the same way. So the only difference is the denominator in our calculation, because it's sort of tied to how we specify the functional unit. So in the first, the denominator is the atmospheric CO2 plus the fossil CO2 that's captured on site. In the second functional unit, it's just the atmospheric CO2. And so you can see numerically these 2 different functions manifested as 2 different denominators yield different results and potentially different interpretations about the system in a comparative context. If you build and you go to the third functional unit, so now we're going cradle to grave, we're including the fate of the captured CO2. We see a small change sort of numerically, and that's because the transport and storage elements are relatively minor in terms of emissions on a full life cycle basis. but the implications in terms of interpretation are different, because the first two functional units leave the fate of the CO2 unaddressed, right? But this third one does not, right? It's very clear that we're going all the way to permanent storage. And then back to this fourth functional unit. So the idea here would be, if we wanted to get basically 1 kilogram of CO2 of net removal and storage, how much for this system, how much CO2 would we have to remove from the atmosphere? And so really we're just scaling up our system and solving for that amount, this variable C. And so when we solve for it, we find that to get 1 kilogram of net removal and storage, we actually need to capture 1.85 kilograms from the atmosphere. So yeah, what you can see just in this sort of simple set of examples is that different functional units for the same system can result in different interpretations and understanding. Yeah, we think it's important that the functional unit is descriptive and precise. That's true for all LCAs, but you know, especially here, we know that without sufficient definition, yeah, there's a likelihood of potential inaccurate interpretation and inappropriate comparison with other systems. And so in our best practices, our recommendation is to use the third functional unit highlighted here. It avoids the ambiguity of the first two, and it avoids sort of the iteration of the fourth. You really need to solve for the third before you can get to the fourth. You can of course scale and get there if that's the value of interest, but we do think it's important to be specific. So capture of atmospheric CO2 and permanent storage. And so shifting gears to another critical element within the goal and scope phase of LCA is the choice of the system boundary. And again, this is sort of, you know, inextricably tied with the functional unit as we defined it. But the system boundary in any LCA defines what's included or excluded from the assessment. And it's got to be tied to the goal of the overall study. When you're comparing two LCA studies, consistency in the system boundaries is just as important as consistency in the functional unit. You can compare systems that have equivalent function, but they may have different boundaries, which again can sort of mislead the comparison. So I'm just going to walk through a series of potential boundaries that could be used in the evaluation of direct air capture. So the first is sort of the narrowest boundary, and that's gate to gate. And really, you're just drawing the box around the facility itself. There are flows that cross the boundary, upstream and downstream, but the impacts of those upstream and downstream processes would not be considered on a gate-to-gate boundary. Only the emissions from the process itself would be included. And so you can see this is really a narrow view. You know, it doesn't provide a really holistic picture. So you could expand upstream and include the cradle to gate boundary. There you're also considering some of the upstream emissions for energy, raw materials, and so on. But we're truncating it at the facility, and so the downstream fate of the CO2 is excluded from this sort of boundary. And then finally, the most encompassing or comprehensive boundary is a cradle-to-grave boundary. That includes all the activities from cradle to grave, extraction of raw materials through the CO2 disposition at the end of life. And so, you know, as we compare these, you know, given the function that we've specified in our functional unit, direct air capture with storage system necessarily requires a cradle to grave boundary. and we think that's the most useful boundary in the context of all carbon dioxide removal approaches. Just one quick note: if the disposition of CO2 is something other than storage, so if it's conversion or EOR, those activities have to be included in the boundary. And it's sort of those sorts of things sort of add complexity to the study because you're introducing additional products. So we do have some pointers to guidance within the best practices for handling those sorts of scenarios, but we primarily focus on permanent storage at the end of life. So just summarize here the best practices for functional unit system boundary. We want to see the mass of CO2 captured from the atmosphere and permanently stored, and that necessitates a cradle-to-grave boundary. Again, for other dispositions of captured CO2, you want to include the downstream fate of the captured CO2 as part of the system. And then it's always helpful to depict the system boundary graphically with a process flow diagram to really clearly indicate which processes might be included or excluded from the system. So shifting to the next sort of stage of LCA, the life cycle inventory, specifically focusing on data collection. This stage focuses, on all of the data that has to be gathered as the key inputs and outputs for the processes within the system. The first and maybe most critical is the sort of the facility operations itself, and depending on the study, the representation of the plant operations could range from actual operating data to a process model. It sort of depends on the technology you're evaluating and what is available. But that's sort of the critical element in collecting data, is understanding for that facility all of the inputs and outputs, raw materials, energy, emissions, products and wastes, and having a sort of a strong accounting for that, ideally tied to either an actual operation. If we sort of fast forward into the future, we have facilities that are operational at scale, or a detailed process model. The other two elements we sort of break into two categories or bins here as consumables and non-consumables. And so consumables are things that would scale as the functional unit scales. So things like utility inputs, heat and electricity, process chemicals and water, whereas non-consumables are not tied to the functional unit. And so these are often sort of modeled as one-time emissions associated with capital equipment, site construction, or sort of initial charging of process fluids or catalysts. And so on the right side of the slide here, we provide within the best practices some key DOE and other federal resources that are available that we think are useful to fill these data requirements. We are specific in the best practices in that we don't prescribe data sources, as we know there's sort of a variety of application specific considerations. However, we do view these as high quality sources that can be used when a study is commissioned. And so the first couple of items from the National Energy Technology Laboratory and Argonne National Laboratory can provide a whole host of information on the energy inputs and material inputs that are required for a DAX facility. The next element, the federal LCA Commons, is a collection of life cycle inventory data from a variety of federal agencies, including the DOE, but also including DOT, USDA, EPA. And the Commons is an open source platform. It's useful and are usable in a variety of modeling platforms as well. And it's really sort of evolving as more and more data becomes available at the federal level. And then the final tool or resource here is one from the EPA, and it's a tool for input-output modeling, which can be used to estimate emissions based on expenditures at a sector level, and it sort of models sectoral interactions throughout the economy. And this tool can be useful for filling data gaps. Things like some of those non-consumables where it's hard to get that information. This is a really useful platform. And so just kind of recapping our best practices for data collection, we think it's really important to really tie the LCA to a process model. And so, that could be a techno-economic analysis, in the sense that they're really sort of going hand in hand. And we think that there should be continuity in the scenarios that are modeled in the TEA that sort of are modeled in the LCA as well. I think the second element is it's useful in the context of reporting the inventory for an LCA to also include physical quantities for process inputs and outputs. This certainly helps with any sort of future harmonization because of differences in underlying life cycle inventory data. The third element here is that sort of the recognition that these technologies are at different stages of development, and you use the data, the best data that's available corresponding to that stage of development. And this sort of dovetails into the fourth, which is the LCA shouldn't be just a one-time activity for developing technology. It ought to be revised as sort of the understanding of the technology evolves and it gets closer to deployment. So yeah, we think that again that the LCA is useful at early stages, but as sort of we get closer to deployment, there may be more information, less uncertainty in some of the design parameters, and so it's important to update the study throughout the cycle. And then finally, sort of the importance of having unique scenarios that again sort of tie back to how the underlying technology performs, and again ideally driven or informed by something like a techno-economic analysis. Just quickly on life cycle impact assessment, two best practices that we have in our document. The first is to utilize EPA's tool for impact assessment, Tracy. And again, the idea here is, while the focus on CDR is obviously on GHG and carbon mitigation, it's important that we have a comprehensive understanding of other potential impacts that could be associated with whether it's material use or energy use to drive the facility. And so our recommendation is to go just beyond GHG accounting and really do a comprehensive assessment of other environmental impacts. And the second item here is we recommend using the latest and greatest IPCC AR6 GWP characterization factors. The factors in Tracy are dated, and so this is sort of a recognition that it's important to sort of use the evolving factors as they're released. So this is sort of what we think of in terms of the important items when it comes to the impact assessment phase of LCA. And then, so the final section that I'll touch on is related to interpretation, which is the final phase of LCA. And the first thing I want to talk about is accounting for and really reporting of negative emissions. So in LCA, negative emissions can arise from one of two situations. The first is a removal of the emission species from an environmental compartment. And so, an example here is biomass uptake of atmospheric CO2 during photosynthesis. It's important to note too that the removal of an emission from one compartment doesn't necessarily imply permanence of storage. That's again sort of why we think about a comprehensive cradle-to-grave boundary as part of the assessment. The second situation in which negative emission can arise is when you have avoided emissions that could be associated with the production of a product by another means. And so the example here is if you have a system with co-products and you use system expansion with displacement or substitution or avoided burden or other ways of referring to it, you can end up with negative values in an LCA. And so it's important to recognize that the interpretation of these two situations that I'm describing here are quite different. So in the first, the emission of interest is physically removed from the environmental compartment. So that amount is defined by the system, by the functional unit. And if we scale up the functional unit, then the physical removal is also scaled up. In the second scenario, the negative emissions don't represent a physical removal, but rather they're describing an avoidance of emissions by opting for one method of production over another. And when an LCA includes a displacement or avoided emissions credit, the implication is the displacement sort of occurs fully in the market. And so, yeah, it's important to differentiate between these two. And from a sort of a practical calculation standpoint, I just want to walk through an example of how this impacts the math and the interpretation. And so going back to our example system again here, the only difference is from the prior system is we now say that our DAC system has a co-product. And this could be a wide variety of things. It could be a physical product, something like potable water, or it could be a co-benefit, or it could be another ecosystem service that DAC could provide. So it's sort of hypothetical, but I think it's important to point out not only for direct air capture, but it may be more relevant as we hope to define these best practices for some other CDR approaches. So yeah, if you look at this system again with a co-product and you report the results with a displacement credit, you could sort of distort the understanding of how the system or how much of the results is actually removal versus avoidance. And so, our recommendation is to really split those out as separate sort of items in the ledger. So yeah, again, just a simple example. It's the same system, same functional unit. The only difference is in scenario 1, there's no co-products, so we have this minus 0.54 that we had from before. And then you can see if we have co-products and you sort of, just run the LCA model and kind of collapse all the accounting to a single number, you'd get this negative 0.74. Whereas, not all of that is actually atmospheric removal. And so the third scenario here instead splits those into two pieces, into a removed portion and an avoided portion. And so we think this differentiation is important to avoid, again, sort of misleading and avoiding tying together two different mechanisms for benefit, which could be, again, avoidance and removal. So when it comes to negative emissions accounting in terms of the interpretation, we recommend separate reporting of avoidance and removal. And then, just sort of broadly, if a facility is capturing both on-site fossil emissions as well as atmospheric CO2, it's important to separately report those values as well. So the next item in the interpretation phase is thinking about sensitivity and uncertainty. We know that LCA is a data-intensive framework. Requires a lot of decisions and data throughout, and really, as a result, the uncertainty and variability sort of manifest from a variety of sources. So there could be uncertainty in parameters. There's uncertainty sort of introduced in the model itself. There's uncertainty due to choices in scenario. So, things like selection of geography or technology or temporal representation. And then also there's sort of just underlying variability, spatial and temporal. And so, all LCAs have a combination of these various uncertainties and variabilities. And we think, DACs in particular, because there's a lack of large-scale operating data, we assume there's quite a bit of uncertainty. And so what we did in our best practices was to lay out, and there's more detail than this table as sort of a truncated version. But we sort of categorized the key data elements within the lifecycle inventory and the key parameters within those that we think should be tested and run as a set of standard scenarios based on the assumptions that we include in the best practices, and then as well tested in terms of a sensitivity analysis. And so again, this table here is just a high-level summary of what those items are that we included. The complete version is in the best practices document. But the idea there is again to try to set up the consistent scenarios for modeling, especially the energy inputs, where we know there could be a wide range of assumptions based on geography or time of deployment. We tried to standardize a set of scenarios in our best practices. And so just kind of reiterating the best practices for sensitivity and uncertainty, we think bounding analysis is important, and that's informed by the scenarios, the standard modeling scenarios that we defined, and then really sort of understanding the sensitivity of parameters that drive the results for a particular design or pathway. And so that's it for our summary today. I want to acknowledge a set of reviewers that we had take a look at an early version of our document. Emily Grubert who at the time was the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Carbon Management, and who is now at Notre Dame. Wee-Sung and Michael from Argonne, Vince and Aaron from EPA, Derek and Matt from NETL, Dwark and Eric at NREL. We got some really valuable feedback from their review, and really appreciate their assistance. And so, yeah, I guess with that, I really appreciate your time today. It looks like we've got 10 minutes for Q&A. Yeah, and if there's anything we don't get to or anything that's unclear, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is here, and then again, here's the URL to the full document. So thank you again. Really appreciate you coming today, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. This is some really fantastic work that you and your team have done, and really appreciate you taking the time to present this. I'm going to give you the chance to kind of look through some of the questions just so you have an idea of what's coming your way. And in the meantime, I'm just going to go over a couple of quick logistics reminders. For those who maybe joined a little bit later than others, this webinar has been recorded and is being recorded, and we will post the recording as well as a PDF copy of the presentation on our event page at usca.org/events. And with that, we're gonna move into the questions. We've got a lot of them coming in, and we have about 8 minutes, so we'll do our best to get through as many as possible, but no guarantees. So the first one is just kind of starting more generally and more about kind of DAC as a technology itself. It can use a lot of energy. Do you have any comments on maybe the kind of what DOE is doing to maybe make it a more efficient energy, efficient technology, and to bring some of that down?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly the difference between solvent-based systems and sorbent-based systems is the heat requirement for basically kind of driving the regeneration process within sort of the loop, and so I think there's a lot of interest in low temperature waste heat type applications, opportunities for co-location, potentially with industrial sources where waste heat might be available. So I think those are opportunities, and certainly those sorts of things would be borne out in the context of an LCA. I think there's also research into electrifying some of these designs as well, right? So taking hopefully low carbon, low GHG intense electricity to drive these processes, where now the sort of the designs require high temperature heat. So I think those are some of the key opportunities that are really being assessed, both at DOE and I think commercially the developers of these systems are certainly doing a lot to pursue those improvements as well.
And then a follow-up to that, kind of as the subject matter expert here, can you discuss kind of the economics or financeability of the technology and kind of what maybe what you're seeing down the road?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to venture there. It's just outside of my area of expertise. So happy to point you to others in my group that are more equipped to do so. So if there's a specific question, yeah, please reach out and I can put you in touch with the right person.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now going into kind of more the nitty gritty of the study itself, can you please explain on why a functional unit has been considered instead of a declared unit for a cradle to gate system boundary?
I see that one. I'm not sure that I completely understand that question. So yeah, if you can either chime in or please reach out to me, be happy to chat offline. But yeah, I'm not sure that I entirely understand that question.
And then I don't know if you saw the next one. Would the selection of a cradle to grave system boundary result in a consequential LCA and not an attributional one? And would ISO 14040 still be relevant for the scope?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my opinion, you know, a cradle to grave boundary doesn't necessarily require a consequential approach. I mean, that said, I think the dynamics that are assessed in a more consequential approach are certainly valid in the context of these systems, especially in, you know, as we're sort of thinking about significant deployment in the future. And so, yeah, I guess from that perspective, I think consequential is maybe relevant, or maybe what I would think of as like more quasi consequential, or tying the analysis to other models, you know, maybe integrated energy models, to really have a better understanding of the sources of impacts and energy that would be driving the process. And then I think just the comment there relative to ISO. I mean, ISO doesn't, the terms consequential and attributional don't show up in the ISO standards. So it's sort of a differentiation that's been, I think, developed by practitioners. You know, maybe it should in some future iteration of the standard, but yeah, I think it's sort of worth calling out that it's not explicitly defined in ISO.
Got it. Thank you. And then another question, could you elaborate on the allocation of burdens and advantages between upstream systems of direct air capture and downstream systems of CO2 storage?
Yeah, so I think on this one, and one of the models or data sources that we point to, and I think this might answer one of the other questions too about end of life. NETL has a detailed study on basically the transport of CO2 and then all of the activities associated with sequestration and a saline aquifer, and sort of all the inputs and activities and various processes associated with that. And yeah, you know, we point to that because it's, I think, a comprehensive way of measuring the impacts of that process, you know, not just from a carbon standpoint, you know, as you're considering the full comprehensive boundary here.
Got it. And I'm going to go through two more questions here, and then pass the mic over to Sheila, as she will have a few comments and maybe a question or two for you as well. So this first question or set of questions, have you considered the time dependence of LCA? This may have a significant impact with DAC, where the rate of CO2 capture is dependent on the weather or slash season, and the carbon intensity of the electricity used to power the power DAC has similar daily and seasonal variation. Yeah,
no, that's a great point, and yeah, I think somewhere we definitely want to get to, you know, as we have a better understanding of how the technology works, you know, across geographies, across, you know, different weather conditions, I could envision sort of a dynamic way of modeling, and again, sort of having the same sorts of information for the energy that's being used. So I don't, we're not there yet, but it's certainly something that I think we would aspire to going forward.
Got it. So an area for future study, if you will.
For sure. Yep.
And then the last question I'm going to throw at you, does the LCA best practices document provide any guidance for how to determine a system baseline for determining avoided emissions for DAC with co-product scenario?
Yeah, we do have a section in the document that goes into more detail on sort of defining an equivalent comparison system. So yeah, it's in there along with a pointer to some additional DOE guidance on that topic. But yeah, I'd be happy to follow up on that one.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Greg. Like I said, this was a great presentation on a fantastic report that you all did. I'm going to pass the mic over to Sheila for a couple more words and potentially a question.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Greg, and thanks Secretary Wilcox. Really, I think there's never been a more important time demonstrating the need for our energy independence and the ability to utilize the resources that we have. And this whole program that you're working on opens up the door to do more with our own resources, maintain our independence, maintain security of supply, maintain security of electric supply. It all goes hand in hand. And you see this fit together and the tremendous dedication of the Department of Energy to making it happen. And we just are so grateful for your time and your brilliant presentation and for DOE's support of our efforts too. So with that, I will leave it be and look forward to maintaining ongoing dialogue with DOE and with you, Greg, and with Secretary Wilcox.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you all so much.
Yep. Thank you all, and hope you have a great rest of your week and a great weekend as it quickly approaches. Again, as a reminder, we will post the presentation and recording on our event page. And with that, I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Thanks, Alex.